Hello, my name is Steve Glover, and I'm the Barrie Legion Branch 147 Public Relations Officer and Branch Historian. I am pleased to provide you with a series of PowerPoint slides associated with our commemoration and remembrance of 80 years ago when the Allied nations fighting against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany and Japan, celebrated the surrender of the German military. The date of the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared to be VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945. We remember all those who served from Simcoe County during World War II. In these slides, we have photos of over 20 Simcoe County World War II veterans and fallen on flag banners and flagpoles just outside of our Branch 147 building. These images were provided to us by many friends and members of the Barrie Legion who wished to pay tribute to an ancestor or someone they admired. They also made very generous donations so that we could purchase the banners and the flagpoles. Many of the men here paid the supreme sacrifice during the war. Others, both men and women, survived the Second World War and returned to Canada to live in a country they had fought for and helped keep free. Here, we will share some of their stories in the hope that you will remember them. 7 Canadian soldiers serving with the British Columbia Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, on May the 5th, 1945. They're in the Netherlands, or Holland as everyone called the country back then. The date of May 5, 1945 is the official date when the German military signed the peace treaty ending all fighting in Holland. This photo was taken by a Canadian Army overseas photojournalist. I don't know his name. He was one of many photojournalists embedded with the Canadian Army fighting throughout Europe. The journalist also wrote the typed post that was stapled and sent along with the photo that had been developed, that went on to the Army headquarters and eventually sent out to be published in newspapers and magazines back home in Canada. There was no such thing as television or TV during World War II. This photo and many more came into my world via a Simcoe County lady named Sue Stanberry. They had been left with her father, Hal Metcalf, by a friend who had been here with the group of Canadian Army photojournalists after the war. Sue's mother and father served and were overseas during World War II. When the war was over, they bought some land around Cookstown, Simcoe County, and became farmers. We are so pleased to have many of these great photos. Both Sue's mother and father have flag banners here at the Barrie Legion. Many of them show it like it was. This is a photo taken from a height of a building in downtown Toronto at Queen and Bay Streets in Toronto from the old Toronto City Hall, where the Toronto Cenotaph is located. It was taken on Tuesday, May 8, 1945, as Torontonians and many others who traveled to Toronto celebrated the end of the war in Europe. Somewhere in that crowd was my future mother and my dad's sister, who traveled to Toronto instead of going into the workplace in Belleville, Ontario, to be part of the celebration. My mother says they did get heck from the boss when they returned, but they wanted to be there. They were up very early that morning to catch a bus to be there. No 401 highway then. And of course, in every major city in Great Britain, the celebration was on. Here we see the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill giving the famous V for Victory salute to the crowd assembled here on VE Day, Tuesday, May 8, 1945. And of course, there were many others who celebrated the defeat of Nazi tyranny in Europe. This photo was taken at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. I suspect it was April 29, 1945, when the U.S. 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions and the 20th Armored Division liberated some 32,000 prisoners at the camp. The American troops found more than 30 railway cars filled with dead bodies of those killed by the German SS guards who had been killed in the last few days of the war. The guards had no time to arrange their removal from the camp. The Necessary War. Canadian historian Tim Cook wrote his 2-volume history of World War II that told of the fight from a Canadian perspective. The first volume was published in 2014. Here, Tim Cook summarizes that the war was a war of good against evil, was fought against a repulsive tyranny, among the worst ever to inflict a violent ideology on oppressed people. There is no doubt in my mind to the truth of this statement. No Price Too High. Another great book written about World War II from a Canadian military historian's perspective. It was written by Terry Kopp and published in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. What Kopp reminds us is that before D-Day, June 6, 1944, the United States and the British Air Forces were responsible for the Allied armies being able to defeat the German enemy ground forces. They took the war to Germany and to the occupied country factories that served the German military-industrial complex. You can certainly see the price the Air Force of Canada paid when you look at the casualty statistics recorded here. They were taken in 1942, 1943, and in 1944 before the Allies created the Second Front in France on June 6, 1944. And there is no doubt that the Soviet Union Army played a very significant role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The forces under their leader, Joseph Stalin, who had signed a peace treaty with Hitler in 1939 and had occupied a portion of Poland and several other nations in Eastern Europe, turned his people and his army around after June 1941, from what originally looked like a massive Soviet defeat into many victories on the Eastern Front, but at a cost of over 20 million civilians and military dead. The wages of war. The next few slides provide the statistics of the war from a Canadian perspective. The first quote was found at the Canadian War Museum in 2017. In 1945, we were a nation of 11 million, and over 1 million aged 18 to 45 signed up for the fight. The rest of the nation took responsibility to grow food and manufacture the armaments needed by our military and the British from plants far away. But the words are very true. We are fortunate the fighting did not occur on our soil. Some 55 million were killed during World War II. Here are the statistics showing the men, women, and each numbers that came in with each force. The Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, Royal Canadian Air Force, nursing services. The next slide shows the casualties that were associated over the time of the war. The statistics speak for themselves. The next photo is just one of many Canadian war cemeteries throughout Europe. Benny-sur-Mer, near Juno Beach, is this photo. One of the many graveyards where Canadian soldiers and Air Force are buried in graves across Europe. It was impossible to bring them all home to be buried. May they rest in peace. The next slide brings us back, and it's July 10, 1945 from the Barrie Examiner and the local impact. Barrie's only high school during World War II was Barrie Collegiate. From the February 10, 1944 edition of the Barrie Examiner, the high school identified 25 names of men that were casualties of the war at this point. There were another 15 months of fighting that would take place. 13 BCI former students were known to have been killed. 5 were missing, and another 4 were known to be prisoners of war. Another 3 were known to be wounded. Remembrance Day Parade in November 11, 1949. This photo taken in Barrie on Remembrance Day 1949 is very similar to all the other photos that are taken each year on November 11. The difference is that the great majority of these veterans who were marching had all been in the fight for democracy just 6 years earlier. And now they are all gone. Who were they? Where can we learn more about them? You think there is information about them at the Barry Legion? The answer is no. These men were never interviewed about their time in the war. The people that knew them are gone too. Outside of the diligence of the local newspapers, we might never know of any of their stories, but it is interesting if you start digging through the digital libraries kept by archival organizations like the Simcoe County Archives and our public libraries. You can learn some of the stories about their time in the service. The Library and Archives Canada will, in 2039, begin to have all their World War II service records placed online. I will be 89 in 2039. Our first flag banner recognizing Pilot Officer Alfred Burke Thompson. The story of this gentleman was shared by Greg Barker from Barrie, who worked in the offices of the Queen's Council here in Barrie and who took the lead on recognizing Alfred Thompson's heroism. An amazing young man born in Simcoe County who joined the local reserve regiment of Simcoe County when he was just 17. And he quickly rose to become a second lieutenant at age 19. But Alfred Thompson wanted to become a pilot and elected to learn how to fly with the British, who were realizing their need to strengthen their military long before Canada did. So he got his wings in Britain and flew for the RAF in late 1937. When Britain declared war on September 3, 1939, he was flying his first mission over Germany the next day, dropping leaflets to tell the German citizens they should resist. On his second mission, a few days later, the Whitley bomber he was flying in developed engine trouble, and the crew were forced to parachute from the plane over enemy territory. A.B. Thompson became the first World War II Canadian prisoner of war. Alfred Thompson was in on the Great Escape from Stalag Luke 3 on the evening of March 24, 25, 1945, and he was able to elude the enemy for over a month before returning to be a prisoner of war. At the end of the war, he returned to Simcoe County, where he had an illustrious career with the Ontario judiciary. Britain relied on food goods and raw materials for her industry that came from many of her Commonwealth nations in North America, Canada, and from the Caribbean. And the enemy was very much aware that these goods had to be brought in via merchant ships that had to cross the Atlantic. The German U-boats were assigned the responsibility to sink the ships that would be crossing over the Atlantic. Canada agreed to take a high level of responsibility for bringing these materials and the armaments that Britain needed. Canada and other North American nations had to provide. From just 13 ships and 3,000 men at the start of the war, the Royal Canadian Navy grew to 373 ships, and just under 100,000 men in uniform by 1945. Canada's merchant navy needed the Royal Canadian Navy to protect the convoys of merchant ships that would bring these goods to Britain. By 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy was responsible for over half of the convoys exporting with RCAF surveillance to the mid-Atlantic point where the British Navy and Air Force could bring these convoys into British ports. Here we see a photo from the Library and Archives Canada, a great photo of a convoy crossing the Atlantic with air coverage provided by the RCAF Eastern Command. Squadron Leader Norval Small. I first learned about Norval Small when I read Canadian historian Ted Barris's book titled The Battle of the Atlantic. Ted identified Norval Small, nicknamed Molly, as having been born in Allendale, now part of Barrie, but a separate community back in 1908. Norval Small's dad was employed by the railway, and at some point in his early years of life, the family relocated to the Hamilton area of Ontario. But when he was just 19, he enlisted with the fledgling RCAF at Base Borden and received his wings in 1931. In 1937, Small left the RCF and became a commercial pilot out on the west coast of Canada. But when Canada declared war in September 1939, Norval re-enlisted with the RCF and was assigned to fly reconnaissance flights looking for enemy activity off the eastern coast of Canada. In the spring of 42, he was squadron leader for the RCF 113th branch. On the 31st of July, he bombed and sunk U-boat U-754 off the coast of Nova Scotia, the first U-boat sunk in Canadian waters. For his actions serving as squadron leader and for getting the first U-boat kill, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross on January 1, 1943. Just 6 days later, while flying with a crew over Gander, Newfoundland, their plane crashed and squadron leader Small was killed. One of Barrie Legion's most recognizable World War II veterans in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was Leo Berard. Born in Manitoba, Leo joined the Winnipeg Grenadiers in 1933 during the Depression. For a period before World War II, he was serving as an instructor at Base Borden. In November 1940, he returned to Manitoba to re-enlist with the Grenadiers. After a period of time defending Jamaica, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, along with the Royal Rifles of Canada, were sent to defend the British Crown colony of Hong Kong. In late 1941, war with Japan was not considered imminent. But in December, the Japanese military launched a series of attacks, starting with the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, then the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and then Hong Kong. The Canadians would find themselves engulfed in hand-to-hand combat against the Japanese 38th Division. After 17 days of fighting, the Canadians and British surrendered. Approximately 290 Canadian soldiers were killed in battle, and while they were in captivity, approximately 264 more died as prisoners of war, for a total death count of 554. In addition, almost 500 Canadians were wounded. Of the 1,975 Canadians who went to Hong Kong, more than 1,050 were either killed or wounded. Leo spent 1 year in a Hong Kong prison camp and then in 1943 moved to Kawasaki in Japan. After 2.5 years there, he was removed to the coal mines at Sendai. The POWs were only 90 miles from Hiroshima. Having survived the war, Leo returned to Canada. After convalescing in hospital, he made the decision to stay with life in the military. For the next 16 years, he was with the PPCLI, starting in 1946. And in 1947, he wrote the story of his time in World War II, titled 17 Days Until Christmas. Jack Parr was born in Barrie in 1919. He was a student at Barrie Collegiate and enlisted in the RCF in September 1940, receiving his wings from the flying school at Dunnville, Ontario in July 1941. He was selected to be a fighter pilot and was assigned to the 403 Squadron with the RCAF in England. His first operational flight was near the end of March in 1942. In 10 weeks following his first flight, he was reported missing in action. After a few weeks, it was learned that he had become a prisoner of war and was now in a special prisoner of war camp where he remained until the end of the war. Although I don't have all the story about his life, we know that he returned to Simcoe County and lived to be 93, passing away in Midland, Ontario. He is celebrated by many who knew him and knew his story and have photos, and they're shared by the Midland Museum and the Midland Branch 80 Legion. Many of us have heard about the August 19, 1942 raid at Dieppe, France. This was supposed to be a surprise secret raid, but it was not kept secret. The Allied nations were intending to create this raid for political reasons. The men assigned would only raid the area, do as much damage as they could, and then return to England. The Canadian Army's 2nd Division was selected to be in on the raid of a French port that was now in occupied France. The raid was intended to happen a month earlier, but was called off when the weather did not support the crossing. It is impossible to expect several thousands of soldiers who had been fully briefed on the raid to not talk about it afterward. And with hindsight, it now seems totally foolish to have executed the same planned raid a month later. As stated here, the single bloodiest day of World War II for the Canadian military. 907 Canadians were killed in the action and almost 2,000 taken prisoners. One of the men who was in on this raid was Jack Poulton. Jack Poulton experienced hard work living on the farm near Kapuskasing in Northern Ontario. He had lived through the Depression years in Northern Ontario, and in 1939 he went to Saskatchewan to find work with the Prairie Harvest. On hearing that Canada was at war, he returned to Ontario and signed up with the Royal Regiment of Canada at Toronto. He was just 21. After basic training, his regiment, the Royal Regiment of Canada, was sent to defend Iceland. In October 1940, he was now in Britain and was continuing to train. The U.S. and Great Britain had a new ally in the Soviet Union when Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, kept demanding that the U.S., Britain, and the Commonwealth nations open a second front in Europe to relieve the Soviet army from the terrible fight they were fighting. It was decided to have the Canadian 2nd Division make a raid at Dieppe, a heavily fortified ending port on the English Channel. The Germans learned of the raid, and some 5,000 Canadian men in the 2nd Division attacked into a trap. Jack, along with almost 2,000 Canadians, were taken as prisoner of war and sent to a camp in Lambsdorff, Germany. On January 22, 1945, as the Soviet army were moving in Germany, the prisoners at Lambsdorff were forced to be on a march across Germany toward the east in the dead of winter. Many died along the way. They were liberated on the 12th of April. Jack would survive. As his daughter Jane Poulton Turvey wrote in the book she co-authored with her dad, Destined to Survive. In 1998, after 50 years of silence, Jack told the story of his life during the wartime. Amazing read. Jack returned to Canada and lived a good portion of his life in Simcoe County. He passed away in 2005, and a celebration of life took place at the Barrie Legion. His daughter Jane, who lives in Barrie, has made it her life's work to research and write the story of the Royal Regiment of Canada, their involvement in the Dieppe raid. She has a website titled Dieppe, Blue Beach, Every Man Remembered. Her aim was to publish a book containing the names, photos, and stories of all the men from the Royal Regiment of Canada who were at Dieppe on August 19, 1942. Canadians had earned the right to have their airmen serving in World War II with their own group, number 6 group, RCAF. As these statistics show, over a third of the men flying with the RAF Bomber Command in 1942 were from other Commonwealth nations, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. And so at the start of 1943, the British Royal Air Force approved 7 bases in Britain for number 6 RCAF. By the end of the war, Canada had 11 bases and 15 RCAF squadrons. Here we see a photo of a bomber crew from 419 Moose Squadron. Sergeant Jim Priest from Minising, Ontario, was part of this Lancaster crew who flew 30 missions over Europe in the summer and fall of 1944. They all returned home to Canada. Charles Chuck MacDonald was an amazing character. Born in Winnipeg, he then moved to Ontario with his family, where he excelled in sports wherever he went. At age 37, he's living in Barrie and is the proprietor of a filling station on Burton Avenue. At age 38, he enlists with the Grey and Simcoe Foresters in June 1940. but he wants to be a pilot. He takes private flying lessons in Toronto and then transfers over to the RCF, getting his wings in late 1941. He is over in the fight in 1942, assigned to an RAF squadron. Back in Barrie, his exploits are being followed by the Barrie Examiner newspaper. On his 42nd mission in April 1943, the Examiner tells the story of MacDonald, who safely crash lands his Lancaster bomber in the Baltic Sea on the shores of neutral Sweden, so that one of the crewmen who was severely imaged when their plane was hit could survive. The neutral Swedish government interns him, but later returns the full crew to Britain in September 43. In the summer of 1944, his bomber is hit by enemy fire. He is able to get the crew back to England, where they parachute to safety. He bails out from the out-of-control plane and survives with a broken leg. On October 31, 1944, at a Victory Loan celebration at the Roxy Theatre, he and Lieutenant Jack Wallace, who we will speak about later, are both hailed as Barrie World War II heroes. In all, he flew over 100 missions in World War II. The photo we have here for the flag banner was obtained through the Library and Archives Canada and made whole by Barrie's extreme imaging. In 1957, MacDonald lost his life in a car accident. Albert, or Bert Kelly, was born in Saskatchewan in 1921. He and his family relocated to Simcoe County around 1929, where they farmed in this rural area. I learned about Albert and his brother John from the Barrie Examiner digital online newspaper collection on the City of Barrie Library website. Albert was killed in action on July 4, 1943, when his Halifax bomber was hit on a mission over occupied France. The image we have from his Canadian Air Force service records was not the best, but again, extreme imaging of Barrie was able to clean it up for this slide and for a flag banner. We also have a slide for his brother, John Kelly, who was training in Canada when they got the news of his brother's death. His brother, who served as a rifleman in the Canadian Infantry, visited Bert's grave in France when he was fighting in the summer of 1944 and wrote a letter home to his parents telling them of his visit to his brother's grave. The Italian Campaign. Following the North African campaigns from June of 1940 to the defeat of the Axis of the Italian army and the German Africa Corps sent to Tunisia in the spring of 1943, the Allied nations made the decision to continue with the fight into Italy to knock out the Italians from the fight. The Italian campaign began with the invasion of Sicily in June of 43, with the 1st Canadian Division in on the Sicilian campaign. The story of the Canadians' Italian campaign was written by Daniel Dancox in his book, The D-Day Dodgers. The phrase was coined by the British and the Canadians who were in the fight to take Italy 11 months prior to June 6, 1944, D-Day invasion in Northwest Europe. As you can see by the statistics shown in the slide, the fight in Italy was no walk in the park. When Italy surrendered, the German army took over the fight, a defensive war that would wear the Allies out. It was the longest continuous campaign in World War II. The next slide details the defensive areas for the fight. Here you see the dates and areas where the Canadian and British armies were fighting throughout the war. From July 1943 in Sicily, then the crossover to the mainland in the fall of 43, and the fight through all of 1944 and early 45 as the Germans held the high ground in every situation. We have stories for several men and women from Simcoe County who were in on this fight. Jack Wallace, born in Victoria, British Columbia in 1919. He arrived in Barrie in 1938 with his family and attended Barrie Collegiate. Jack enlisted with the Royal Canadian Dragoons on September 13, 1939 at Base Borden. He went overseas in early 1941 and was taken on strength with the Three Rivers Regiment. His regiment was in on the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. In 1998, he wrote a story for the Canadian Military History series titled Sherman's in Sicily, The Diary of a Young Soldier, summer 1943. At this time, Wallace was a 23-year-old lieutenant commanding a squadron of Sherman tanks with the Three Rivers Regiment. The battle for Sicily, the soft underbelly of fascism, as Churchill called it, was the first taste of war for Wallace and many other young Canadian soldiers. After the liberation of Sicily, Jack Wallace's unit went into action in late September 43 on the eastern coast of Italy. On October 6, his troop of tanks supported British troops attempting to hold off a German counterattack near Termoli. On the second day of a fierce two-day battle, Wallace's Sherman was destroyed by enemy tank fire. Severely wounded, he was pulled from the burning wreck by the only other crew member to survive. Soon after, the enemy tanks were outmaneuvered and forced to retreat. For his crucial role in checking this counterattack, Jack Wallace was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. After spending 6 months in North African and English hospitals, he was evacuated to Canada in May 1944. Some years ago, I met Bill Moyer's daughter, Yvonne Buchanan, who shared information about her father's time in the service of his country. Bill had come to live in Simcoe County following World War II, remaining in the military and serving out of Base Borden. Yvonne learned about our Barrie Legion plans to honor Simcoe County World War II veterans and fallen. She shared information about her father and put me in contact with her son, Kevin, who helped me understand his grandfather's time during World War II. This photo of Bill shows him in the uniform of the 48th Highlanders, taken before he went overseas in 1940. Later that same year, Bill, now in England, was transferred to the 1st Reconnaissance Regiment and later the 4th Reconnaissance Regiment in 42. While he arrived in Sicily in August of 43, the fight he was involved in on October 6 was a major fight. His Bren gun carrier was hit along with several other vehicles in an ambush. Several months of hospital and recuperation made him fit to join the fight back in Italy in the spring of 44, and then on to finish the war in Holland in February 45. A longtime friend and proud member of the Barrie Legion, we have a photo of him supporting our Poppy campaign. Dorothy Macomb, born in July 1910 on a farm her grandparents had settled in near New Lowell in Simcoe County, Ontario. This photo of her was shared by her nephew, Tom, and his wife, Laura Macomb, who provided with me so many details about her life. As a child growing up on this farm, her dream was to become a missionary or a nurse. She enrolled in Women's College Hospital, a school of nursing, in 1929 and graduated in 1932, and worked as an assistant supervisor in the hospital's operating room. She enlisted for World War II on September 10, 1939, just 1 week after war was declared, and left for England in June 1940, serving the 15th Canadian General Hospital. She served with Canadian medical units in Bramshot, Chase, Basingstoke, and Copthorne, treating illnesses, burns, broken jaws, and other injuries requiring plastic surgery. In October 1943, now with the rank of captain, she and her medical unit supported the 1st Canadian Corps through the Italian campaign. In mid-1944, she was posted to number 8 Canadian General Hospital in England, and then through France, Belgium, and Holland as the Allies progressed through Northwest Europe. In December 44, she was promoted to principal matron with the rank of major. Joining Women's College in 1946, she ushered the hospital through a period of growth and transformation, tripling in size to become a 450-bed teaching institution. She won a City of Toronto Merit Award in 1976 and was named to the Order of Canada in 1940. Bill Fort's story was shared with me by his family. Born in Vestrip Township in 1923, he enlisted and trained with the Canadian Armored Corps. By December of 1943, he was in Italy, where he was assigned to train as a wireless operator with the British 8th Army. A few months later, he's in the fight as a tank gunner until June of 1944. Then he transfers to the medic as a stretcher bearer with the Strathconas following this period, and continued to serve in Italy until the 1st Canadian Division and the 5th Armored Divisions were removed in late February to join in the Northwest Europe campaign. Bill never forgot about his time in the military. Bill returned to Italy and the Netherlands on numerous occasions to visit the graves of his friends. In 2010, he received a commendation from the Minister of Veterans Affairs as a role model for veterans. James Burke came to Barrie when he was just 6 and attended public and high school in Barrie during the Depression years. At age 19, he enlisted with the RCAF in August 1941 and graduated as an air gunner in October 1943. Assigned to the RCF 422 Squadron, his crew flew anti-submarine patrols to protect the shipping lanes near Great Britain. Their Sunderland Mark III was missing in action on May 24, 1944, and it was believed to have been shot down over the English Channel by enemy submarines. James was just 21 years of age. Here is a map that shows the Allied Army invasion forces assigned to the beach fronts in Normandy, France, that morning, June 6, 1944. The Americans were assigned to take the western beaches, codenamed Omaha and Utah. The British were assigned Gold and Sword, and in between were the Canadians assigned Juno Beach. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had landed as many as 155,000 troops in France by sea and air. 6,000 vehicles, including 900 tanks, 600 guns, and about 4,000 tons of supplies, and astonishingly had achieved complete surprise in doing so. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but the battle had just begun. The bridge had to be secured and expanded to prevent the Wehrmacht from driving the Allies back into the sea. June 6, D-Day 1944, Juno Beach was assigned to the Canadian forces. Over 14,000 Canadians involved in the landing that day. Although only one Canadian unit reached its D-Day objective, the first line of German defenses had been taken. By the evening of June 6, Canadian troops had progressed further inland than any of their allies. The casualties were less than expected, but it was a bitter fight. 340 Canadians had given their lives. Another 574 had been wounded, and 47 were taken prisoner. Born in Manitoba and adopted by the Goheen family of Stroud in Simcoe County, Ernest, or Ernie as he was known, came to live on their farm in Craigville when he was just 5 years old. In June 1940, he enlisted with the Grey and Simcoe Foresters and went overseas with them in June 1943, part of the 26th Armored Tank Brigade. When the decision was made to break up the 26th Anti-Tank Brigade, Guardsman Goheen found himself with the 21st Armored, Governor General's Foot Guards. Goheen went ashore on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the war began in earnest for Ernie. Little play on words there. As a tank driver, he fought in all of the major battles through Normandy and the coastal towns along the English Channel. Goheen recalled one occasion when his tank was hit by a German 88mm shell in the gas tank. The tank caught fire, but the crew were able to escape. Ernest brought home a war bride from Scotland, and raised his family in Simcoe County. Harold Mills was born in St. Vincent Township, Grey County, Ontario, on August 23, 1919. He enlisted in the Army on July 24, 1940, with the Grand Simcoe Foresters and served at Camp Borden during World War II. By February 1943, Harold had advanced through the ranks to become a lieutenant in the Grand Simcoe Foresters Armored Regiment. From the summer of 42 to June 43, he was an instructor at Base Borden and the Meaford Tank Range, teaching recruits Tank Corps maneuvers and tactics. From June 16, 1943 to June 44, he was in England taking courses and training tankers in wet beach landings in prep for D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Harold, along with the first Hussars, were launched 1 to 2 miles out to sea in duplex drive swimming tanks to lead the invasion at Juno Beach. Out of the 19 tanks launched by his squadron, only 4 were left at the end of D-Day. On June 11, 1944, Harold was killed in action at Le Mesnil-Patry, France. He is buried at Bretteville-sur-Lys in the Canadian War Cemetery. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division arrived in France at the beginning of July and joined the units already in Normandy to form the 2nd Canadian Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Caen was finally taken by July 10, and the Canadians now set out to capture Verrières Ridge. In just 4 days of fighting, the 2nd Canadian Corps took over 2,000 casualties, and the enemy still held the ridge. Doug Shaughnessy, a very quiet gentleman, was always at the Barrie Legion for every Sunday afternoon general meeting when I joined the branch in the late 2010. As I learned from his son, Tim, Doug was one of several Legion members who remortgaged their homes to help finance the new Barrie Legion building at 410 St. Vincent Street. And he was president of Branch 147 in 1969. Born in Midhurst in 1924, he had moved to Hamilton and at 17 joined as a boy recruit with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry in 1941. In 43, Doug, or Sandy as he'd been nicknamed, was training in England and assigned to the 13th Platoon of Charlie Company. Here he met Harry Green from Port Sydney, Ontario, who became his best friend while they were training in England. In February 44, both Harry and Sandy trained with the Scout Platoon as commandos assigned to go ahead of their regiment to surveil all the enemy positions. A month following D-Day, Doug and Harry were heavily involved in the fight around Verrières Ridge. The RHLI took the town of Verrières on July 25 and survived a major counterattack by the enemy later that night. Except for Dieppe, the fight for Verrières Ridge was the single bloodiest day for Canada in World War II. On August 12, Private Harry Green was killed by enemy machine gun fire. Private Shaughnessy found his body later that night. Later in life, Doug wrote a tribute story about his friendship with Harry Green that the Wilfrid Laurier University has on file. Phil Marshallton was born on October 13, 1913. In high school, he developed into an excellent pitcher. In 1940, Marshallton made 2 starts for the American Baseball League Philadelphia Athletics. He won 17 games in 1942, but after the season, he signed up with the RCAF. He was commissioned a pilot officer with No. 2 Training Command at Winnipeg on July 22, 1943. Overseas, he served with the 433 Squadron of the RCAF as a tail gunner in a Handley Page Halifax bomber. During the night of August 16, 1944, Marshallton flew his 26th mission, laying mines in Kiel Bay, just 4 missions away from being able to go home. As the bomber flew above the Baltic Sea on the way to its target, it was attacked and set ablaze by a German night fighter. The pilot gave orders for the crew to bail out, but only the navigator and Marshallton escaped. Stranded in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea, both crew members faced death from hypothermia before being picked up by a Danish fishing boat and then handed over to the German authorities. Marshallton spent the remaining years of the war as a prisoner of war. By mid-January 45, the German guards evacuated the camp where he was and forced marched the prisoners to Bremen. Suffering from exhaustion and frostbite, many died along the way in what would become known as the infamous Death March. On May 2, 45, Marshallton and his fellow prisoners were finally liberated. He was flown back to England to recuperate, then returned to Canada by boat. He did return to play professional ball in the American League until 1950. He was inducted into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame and the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. At this time, we don't have a flag banner, but we've written the Library and Archives Canada expect to have one soon. The soldier story, Victory at Falaise. As it reads here, Normandy cost the Allies close to 2,500 casualties a day, 75% of them among the combat troops at the sharp end who had to carry the battle to the enemy. It was their valor, their endurance, and their ability to adopt that won the Battle of Normandy and launched the liberation of Western Europe. Captain Alexander Sandy Peyton, born March 17, 1920 in England, Alexander Peyton came to Canada in 1923 and lived in British Columbia. After attending university, Peyton enlisted and went overseas in 1943. He served with the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment and landed at Juno Beach on June 11, 1944. He was awarded the Military Cross for Bravery for his actions at Tote, France on August 31, 1944. He remained in the military following the war, serving at baseboard. Staff Sergeant Harold Hell Metcalf. A very remarkable story as I learned it from his daughter, Sue, who several years ago came to the Barrie Legion and allowed me to scan a number of Canadian Army overseas photos that her father, Hell, had been given by a friend. Her father was a young boy when his dad died of the Spanish flu. As a young boy growing up in Toronto, he was sent to be with other members of the family who were farmers in Simcoe County. He loved the country life. Hell joined the Royal Canadian Engineers and trained for the war in Northwest Europe, arriving in France just 3 days following the D-Day invasion. His specialty was in building the bridges to help the men and the vehicles cross the rivers where there were no more bridges. On September 1, near Abbeville, the jeep he was riding in hit a buried landmine, and he was sent back to Britain with a major foot wound. While recuperating in the hospital and munching on some chocolates sent to him by his aunt for his birthday, one of the Canadian nurses working at the hospital, Lieutenant Ruth Jack, told him that it would soon be her birthday, and so he shared chocolates with her. His foot injury was too severe for him to return to active duty, and Hal returned to Canada in February 45 and discharged from the Army in April. In June of that year, he married that nurse. In 1949, they moved to the Cookstown area of Simcoe County and took up a life of farming. His dream of owning land and living by his own labor came true. As told in the previous slide for Staff Sergeant Metcalf, Ruth Jack met her future husband when he was sent to the British hospital where she was a nursing sister. Somehow his sharing some chocolates would result in a bond that would result in their marriage and their living a life together after the war in Simcoe County. With the start of the Northwest Europe invasion in June 1944, Lieutenant Jack would work 12-hour shifts nursing the men and sending them who were sent back from the casualty clearing stations in France, Belgium, and Holland for the balance of the war. Sergeant George Gardner was another man who came to Simcoe County after World War II. He remained with the Medical Corps after the war, posted to Base Borden. This is here where he trained men and women in the Medical Corps. He retired from the Canadian military in 1968 and served as the Chief Warrant Officer and Regimental Sergeant Major. During World War II, he worked in the casualty clearing stations in France, Belgium, and Holland, a 36-year career in the Canadian military. In March 1944, Private John Kelly, serving with the Royal Canadian Signal Corps, was sent to England. He was transferred to the Royal Winnipeg Rifles following the D-Day invasion. On July the 1st, 1944, he was wounded by a bullet in his leg, and while he was on the attack for the Carpiquet Airport. Sent back to England, he returned just after 2 months of hospitalization for the fight in early September 1944. Just a few weeks later, on September 25, in the fight for the French coastal town of Calais, he suffered a major concussion when an enemy high explosive shell landed near him. He was sent unconscious back to a hospital in England. Because his World War II service records are not available, we do not know if John's concussion ended his time in the conflict. We do know he was back in Simcoe County by September 45 and was married to Eleanor Hill. His brother Bert is buried in the Poix de Picardy churchyard in France. We are fortunate his mother shared details from John's letter he sent home shortly after his visit to his brother's grave. He wrote, "Please, Mother, don't feel too badly about Bert being gone, for as I stood there beside his grave, I thought I would burst with pride and emotion. And remembering the words, 'Greater love hath no man than he who laid down his life for his brother.' And Mom, I am proud to be able to say I fought on the same soil that Bert and the rest of our Air Force made it possible for us to liberate. Good night, Mom. And remember, Bert always said, keep your chin up." October 1, 1944 to November 8, 1944, the clearing of the Scheldt area in Belgium and Netherlands. 5 weeks of difficult fighting at a high cost, 12,873 Allied casualties. By November 29, 1944, the first Allied convoy entered the port of Antwerp. Just another photo from the Canadian Army overseas showing you the post that was limited here as the troops were traveling through Belgium, clearing the Scheldt. World War II veteran Frank Tascona's parents immigrated to St. Boniface, Manitoba from Sicily in 1903 and raised 16 children. Frank joined the Queen's Own Rifles in 1942, and for their landing at Juno Beach, Frank was told he was going to be a stretcher bearer, required to be the first line of medical assistance on the front lines. According to an article about him in the Barrie Advance back in the 1990s, Frank told the officer that he didn't know anything about first aid, and he was told that he would learn it quickly, and he did that as he carried many a man off the beaches on the 6th of June for the remainder of the war. In action on the 27th of October, 1944, Frank was acting as a stretcher bearer for D Company. He was wounded, but before he could be helped, he rescued Lieutenant Charlie Jones and 2 other soldiers before he was taken to a hospital in Belgium and sent back for the fight. For his actions, Frank received the Military Medal for Bravery by King George VI, along with 5 other members of the Queen's Own Rifles. In the photo, Frank is on the left. 1945, the Operation Veritable and Blockbuster. When it ended in March 10, 1945, Operation Veritable and Blockbuster cost over 5,000 Canadian casualties. Most, however, were suffered in just 13 long, bitter days from Feb 26 to March 10. Blockbuster, a total of 3,638 casualties. Born in Penetanguishene in 1917, Stan Corbeau joined the Simcoe Foresters in 1933 as a private and rose to the rank of second lieutenant in November 1939. At the outbreak of World War II, Corbeau remained attached to the GSF at Camp Borden through its transition to the 26th Armored Tank Battalion. In October 1942, he was attached to Headquarters 2nd Canadian to Headquarters 2nd Canadian Army Tank Brigade at Borden and promoted to the rank of captain. In August 43, he went to England for training in use of the duplex drive systems for armored vehicles. In preparation for the D-Day invasion, Corbeau worked closely with Major General Sir Percy Hobart of the British 79th in simulation trials, testing and strategies development for armored vehicle breach landings. On June 6, 1944, Corbeau landed at Juno Beach, Normandy, with the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade in support of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. In September 1944, Corbeau was appointed officer commanding of the 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, the Kangaroos, with a rank of major. With Corbeau in command, the Kangaroos took part in an operation to close the Falaise Gap and the capture of Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, and the breaching of the Siegfried Line. The squadron was absorbed into the 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Regiment with Corbeau in command through the liberation of the Netherlands and into Germany. It was during his time as officer commanding 1 Cap CR that he received the DSO, and he remained active in the Canadian military until his retirement in 1966. One more photo showing the joyous Dutch near the end of April 1945, throwing their hats and their leaflets in the air. And our final slide, we honor Private Lorne Williams. Lorne was born in North Bay in 1927. He began his military career in 1940 when he joined number 16, the Gateway Lions Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Cadets. Since he was only 16 at the time, Lorne enlisted as a boy soldier, not becoming a private until he turned 17. Lorne joined partly with the intention of meeting up with his father, Cecil, who at the age of 32 had joined the Royal Regiment of Canada early in the war. Lorne hadn't seen his father since he went off to fight. Lorne was too young to be sent overseas, and as the war ended a year later, he did his service in Canada with the Royal Canadian Infantry Corps, and for a brief 2 months with the Royal Regiment of Canada with his father, who was now back from Europe. Released from active service in 1945, Lorne went on to other pursuits, such as learning the sheet metal trade. However, the Army never left Lorne's heart, and on September 27, 1949, he joined the Canadian Army Militia in Barrie as a gunner with the 45th Anti-Tank Regiment. The Grand Simcoe Foresters, and over the next 30 years, Lorne rose up through the ranks. In 1971, Lorne reached the rank of Warrant Officer First Class and was appointed the Regimental Sergeant Major, the senior non-commissioned member of the regiment. He served as RSM of the GSF until he retired from the GSF in 1979. In 2003, Lorne was appointed the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the GNSF, and Lorne served as curator of the GNSF Museum, which is located in downtown Barrie on Mulcaster Street. Thank you so much for paying attention to these men and women.